Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first noon lecture of the 2023-2024 school year. My name is Ann Lin. I think I've met most of you. I'm the director of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, and we're really thrilled to have you all here for today's talk and also for all of our other activities this semester. Just a couple of things I want to highlight for you. You probably have heard about these if you've been at our other events, but we have a fantastic 2 weeks coming up with a concert performance with the performance of the National Chinese Orchestra Taiwan, who will be coming at the end of September. And they will be doing both large and small group activities, culminating in a free concert at Hill Auditorium on Tuesday? Wednesday. I keep getting that wrong. Wednesday the 4th. Okay. Yeah. Fantastic. So we will be doing a panel with them for our community that Monday in the afternoon. And so I hope to see many of you there, and please tell other people about that event. The other thing I want to say is specifically for our students, our researchers, and our faculty. The noon lecture is a fantastic institution of the center, obviously started many, many, many years before I even got to the University of Michigan. And one of its most special features is that we really crowdsource the speakers. We really ask you, our faculty, our students, our researchers, to let us know whom you would like us to invite. If you know about people who are doing great work and you'd like to have them speak about it, especially when it's new work, if you know people whom you've always admired and never had a chance to meet, this is your opportunity. We come to you, or more specifically, you come to us, you come to Ina and say, I would really love to have such and such a person here, and then we will do our best to get it on the schedule. We are often, we schedule obviously more than a semester in advance. And so just because you ask for somebody doesn't mean we'll be able to get them there next week or certainly next month, and maybe not even, unfortunately, the next semester, but it certainly goes on our list. And we really love the opportunity to be able to bring you in touch with the best people doing work in all areas of Chinese studies, China-related studies, in every discipline. So please remember that. I also do a plug for our faculty, although I don't have a ton of faculty here, but please remember that among other things we are restarting post-pandemic is the Hughes Scholar Program. That is a program that allows us to bring scholars from China, Taiwan, Hong Kong to the US for a semester or for a year. Again, these scholars come by your nomination. It is not an open call. People do not see the opportunity and apply to us. It's because you reach out to us because of great people that you know who you think would really benefit from the opportunity to be on campus and whom you think our community would benefit from the opportunity of seeing. So that, in addition, I think if you are a student, rather than one of our faculty members, one of the ways to do this is to talk to one of our faculty associates about this great person that you think would really welcome the opportunity to be here, and we can move on from there. All right, so without any further ado, thank you all so much for being part of this program, and I am going to give the microphone to Sonia Ospe, who will tell us about today's speaker.
Thank you, Anne. So I too wish to welcome you to the first presentation in the noon lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies, LRCCS, for fall 2023. The complete series schedule is available here today, right there, and on the China Center's website. Email reminders are sent out weekly. So I will begin with just two quick announcements before I introduce the speaker. So on Saturday, September 23rd, the Fall 2023 Festival of Asian Music will present Violin Meets Huqin, a transnational sonic encounter. This event will take place at 4 p.m. in the Britain Recital Hall of the Moore Building on North Campus. It is free, It is open to public. This festival is being presented by the Stern's collection of musical instruments and the Asia Centers of the International Institute. The next presentation in the fall 2023 LRCCS noon lecture series will take place on Tuesday, September 26th, and will be given by Matthew King of the University of California, Riverside. He will be speaking on, quote, "If you meet the medical Buddha on the road, kill him. Tibetan Buddhist refusals of brainhood and as the figure of modernity," end quote. Today's presentation will be given by Alexus McLeod, Professor of Religious Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. His work is primarily in early Chinese philosophy and Mesoamerican philosophy. He published many books, and he is the author of, most recently, The Tao of Madness, Mental Illness and Self-Cultivation in Early Chinese Philosophy and Medicine. It came out of Oxford University Press in 2021. And he's also the author of An Introduction to Mesoamerican Philosophy, which came out of Cambridge University Press in 2023. He's also the editor of the journal, The Philosophical Forum. He makes me look bad. Today, Alexus will be speaking on changing conceptions of human completing in late warring states and early Han texts. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to talk to you today a little bit about Cheng. And to give a little bit of background for this project, so this is kind of part of a larger project, a book project that I'm working on the idea of the human role in completing the cosmos, the human role in kind of constructing the world as we experience it in early China, Mesoamerica, and West African traditions, which have some kind of similarities concerning the ways that they think about these things. And really, I kind of came to this project through this stuff, right? Through the Chinese conceptions of Cheng, which change, as I'll explain here, particularly in early Han texts connected to correlative cosmology, and in specific in the Huainanzi, which I'll spend a little bit of time looking at here as well. So Cheng is a difficult one, right? So there are a number of different kind of senses of the term. We see Cheng in the sense of something like completion, creation, but also in this kind of normative sense of this summative kind of state of a thing, or the perfection of a thing, right? The development in this sense. And this construction of a thing that's connected to this idea of Cheng seems to be connected to some kind of internal or external plan or ideal. Right? So a thing is Cheng when it achieves this kind of intended state. We can think of something like a piece of furniture that you construct on the basis of a manual. When you put it into its right kind of position, this is a Cheng, right? It's what it's supposed to be in this sense, connected to this ideal. One sense, of course, of Cheng is the sense of matured or developed or fully grown, right? So we see in Lushi Chunqiu a kind of example of this, right? When we got this discussion of the generation of things, where you begin with sheng, right? You begin with generation, and then growth, and then to becoming large or fully grown, and then Cheng after this. But then when you have Cheng, right, then you go into decline, right? So you have here a decline, and then ultimately death, right? And so there's this explanation of Tao in terms of this kind of like arising, achieving some highest point, which is Cheng, and then a decline from there, right? So we can think about this as it's like something being in its prime, for example, right, as a kind of Cheng. So we see this kind of contrast in numerous texts between sheng, generation, and Cheng. In the Tai Sheng Shui, one of these unearthed texts in the Guodian text, we see the first creation of things from Tai, right, to Tai Sheng Shui. At first, it shengs, it creates, it generates water, and then these successive creations after this are understood in terms of Cheng. Right? So you've got this initial thing, and then a Cheng is some other kind of creation, but it's not exactly the same as sheng. It's a different sort of creation. While in other places, these terms seem to be used interchangeably. Right? Later in the Tai Sheng Shui, for example, they come back to talking about sheng in the way that looks very similar to the way that they used. They used Cheng in the way that looked very similar to the way that used sheng. So one sense that we see in a number of early texts is the kind of ethical sense of Cheng. So in 10.6 of the Xunzi, right, they talk about the role of the sage in completing things in Cheng, right? So that heaven and earth the idea is generates things, and that the sage completes things. And completion in the sense of kind of putting things in order, right? Including moral cultivation of the self, right? Or organization of society, right? This is the work that the sage does that brings things, the Wangwu to completion. In the Lunchi Chunqiu, we see the connection of Cheng to nourishment as well. So the idea here is that you've got that which begins and generates things, right, is tian, right? Tian does this work of originating, and then that which nourishes and completes the things is humanity, right? We take what's created by tian and then nourish it somehow, right, and complete it, right? We do something to it, we organize it in a way that completes it, right? That gives us something like order. We see this in Chunqiu Fanlu as well, right? In this distinction that's made here between the work of heaven, earth, and humanity, right? In connection with the myriad things. And so the heaven, earth, and humanity are the root of the myriad things, and that they each have these kind of different roles. So that Tian has the generative role, Di has this nutritive role, the nourishing role, and then Ren humanity has the completive role, the Cheng, right? That happens after this process. So the way that these seem to be understood in these texts, right, and the way the kind of ethical sense is understood, is about human shaping of something like natural moral feelings or organization of society, right? So there's a consideration of how things like rituals can shape attitudes and behaviors, right? They can lead to a kind of particular kind of social order, and this seems to be the way they're thinking about Cheng in this ethical sense. That is, we operate what we're chunging in a sense, right? We're operating on ourselves. We're operating on the world in terms of our organization of that world in ways that are going to make things useful for us, right, and useful for human society. So, of course, there's this other sense of Cheng is something like finished, to be finished or completed in some sense, is to arrive, and this is linked to what I was saying before, is to arrive at the intended point, right? The point at which a thing is supposed to be, right? The ideal state, something like this. And it presumes a way that things are supposed to be, right? That is the plan, right? For the furniture we put together, the finished plan, or a way things are when they fully develop. Right? So in 1.6 in the Zhuangzi, right, in this discussion of the kind of these enormous this enormous gourd that's supposed to be useless, there's this discussion of the Cheng of the tree that then gives forth this fruit that is enormous, right? It's five stone, right? So the idea here is this Cheng is seen as a full development of the tree, of the plant in this sense. And so you get a move to also the active participation of completion, right? So not just the kind of unfolding of this kind of ziran type of activity of an object, right, of a plant growing on its own, but also this idea of participation of humans is part of this as well. And so also in the Zhuangzi in 2.6, right, you have this kind of famous bit here about the Tao that's chunged through the practicing of it, right? So we follow a Tao, right? We walk on a Tao, and thereby it's Cheng, right? Thereby it's completed, it's finished, something like this, right? Just as with Wu, as with things are kind of spoken of, and thus they are Ran, right? Or we want to see that they're so, or they're made so by their being named in this particular way. We also in the Zhuangzi in chapter 22 see this kind of this structure where there's a similarity or the kind of parallel here is the discussion of the Da Mei, right, and the Mingfa, and then the Cheng Li, right? The completed li, right? The completed patterns, right? And this is one of the things that seems to be used in some of these Han texts, like the Huainanzi, in thinking about Cheng, right? In a way that we might complete the inherent patterns of the myriad things, right? Things in the world, right? Which is the interesting move, right? The idea being that things aren't necessarily just there that we encounter in the world, but that we are somehow doing things. We're doing something to them, right? We're completing this the manifestation of the patterns, and we'll see a kind of example of this in the Huainanzi. So if we think about the Cheng as something like the fullest development of a thing or the kind of sense of maturity, this also is connected to this other kind of conception where we might understand it as something like perfection, right? So the Chengxin, right? The completed mind, right, is something like the perfected mind, right? The one that's been organized in the right way, right? And has the right kinds of insights because of the kind of cultivation that we're engaged in. So this concept of Cheng as perfected, the idea is that the sage, right? There's often a discussion of this in terms of the sage, right? That is, the cultivated person is completed, right? The person who's been completed, the Cheng Ren in this sense, but they're also one who completes other things, right? So the sage has this kind of completive ability to operate in the world in a certain way, whether it's organizing society or whether it's constructing things in this kind of Huainanzi sense. And this is understood in many texts through a kind of process of civilization and refinement, right? So the idea is that we, kind of proper use of the rituals, or the sages, right? Institution of the rituals, right? And if we look at a text like Xunzi. There's a discussion of this even in the Intellects, where they talk about the Cheng Ren, right? And the Cheng Ren, of course, here is associated with these various kinds of virtues, right? And of course also ritual and music, right? That leads to the construction of this Cheng Ren, right? So it's through this kind of moral self-cultivation that one becomes a Cheng Ren. Right? And so this is this kind of perfection of the person, right? Perfection in terms of the Ren Dao. In the later Han etymological text, Shiming, we see Cheng defined as sheng, right? This is this kind of also this idea of the perfective notion of Cheng. In the Guanzi, we see this as well, right? And this also this discussion of the kind of different role of things in terms of what the Sheng Ren does. Although here, interestingly, we get this claim about that humans first Shengzhi, right? That people first create or generate things, and then Tian does the work of shaping them, and then after this, the sage is the one who completes things, right? This is this understanding of the kind of proper process where you get this completion at the end as well, right? The perfection, right? Things are brought to perfection in this sense through the operation of the work of the sage. So one of the important things that happens in the Han is what I've called before this naturalistic shift, and you get a movement in many of the Han texts, late Warring States and early Han texts, toward a conception of Cheng as playing a more formative role in not just a kind of moral perfection of the world or organization of the world in terms of its connection to society, but in structuring the world itself, right? The world that we encounter, right? The idea being that what we encounter in terms of tables and chairs and whatever it is, right, has this element of being constructed by humans somehow, right? Mind dependent, we might say, right? You get this kind of this position that seems to develop in the Han. And so, of course, correlative cosmology is one of the important features of the early Han, which develops during this period and links everything from natural activity to human behavior to processes such as the wuxing, right, and yin-yang, right, with the idea being that we can understand anything in terms of the shifting of these phases and the way that they linked to one another, and then their amount of qi in terms of their yin qi and yang qi, et cetera, right? This entire system that's discussed in many of these texts, like the Chunqiu Fanlu. So one of the things, of course, that's going on in this period that's been discussed by numerous scholars is the influence of the Fangshi, right? These various kinds of scholars who are working on things like astronomy and medicine, right? And they're dealing with these kind of processes and practices that are very much linked to manipulation of the world and what we might call kind of naturalistic processes. And the thought and influence of the Fangshi in the early Han court refocuses the kind of the scholarship that you see emerging in the Han on metaphysics, right? So you see things like correlative cosmology that get this big focus there that you don't find as much in earlier material. And it leads to these kind of new understandings and new employment of concepts like Cheng in connection to the formation of the world and processes of change, right? So now they're talking about Cheng in ways that they're still using it in this ethical sense, but they're also using it in these other senses that have to do with kind of construction of the world, right? And new ways they're thinking about the human role in construction of the world. So this is linked to, so what we see in Lushi Chinqiu 13.2, right? There's a discussion of what the sages do, right? The work of the sages. What they did was that they Cheng their self, right? They completed their self, and in this, the whole world was completed. Just like they ordered themselves, and in this, the whole world was ordered, right? So they're doing something that the sage here is operating on the self in a way that has some kind of effect on tian sha, right? On the world. And we'll see a kind of some explanation of this kind of process in the Huainanzi. So in the Huainanzi, of course, the big concern is giving this account of kind of how to make sense of all these various disparate things in the world and tying them together in this kind of synthesis, right? A kind of Han Dynasty imperial project. And so we see a general pattern that follows this root and branch structure. The idea being that we can have knowledge of the world through understanding a pattern underlying all things in terms here of the root, and then the specific kind of areas of human knowledge, right? The specific kind of disciplines or whatever it is are understood in terms of moi. Right? So we have astronomy, medicine, right? All these various areas, military, all these various areas of human knowledge, and these are moi, and we can think of the same way of like languages, customs, rituals, etc. And that there's an underlying root, right? That unifies all of these. Right? This is this kind of unification process that the Huainanzi is looking for. And so the text offers a general picture of what's necessary to complete, right, to Cheng, to understand and to employ the tianli, right, the heavenly, the patterns of nature, right, in order to organize society. So they're still very much focused on the idea of proper organization of society, and Liu An, right, was concerned with the kind of showing the ruler, right, in this case the emperor, the best way to organize society using this kind of structure, this Bamois structure of understanding the world. And so there are a number of different kinds of effects that are discussed here, right? In terms of things like resonance between humanity and nature, right? Between ren and tian, right? That we can perform actions, or humans can act in certain ways that have this kind of resonance that create particular kinds of effects in the world. And there's a suggestion that goes all the way to, as we'll see in the Tianwen chapter, to this idea that humans can somehow influence the motions of the activities of Tian, right? That humans can have some kind of constructive role in the way that Tian manifests itself, or in the way that Tian acts. So we see this kind of most prominently in the third chapter of the Huainanzi, the Tianwen chapter, which is on its surface about astronomy, music, right? And how to understand the role of things like astronomy and music and the tones and their connection to the celestial realm, how we can use this in government. And you find this discussion of generation and completion in the Tianwen chapter. Cheng, as it's used in Tianwen, tends to be used in the sense of creation in the chapter, right? So an example of this where we see Cheng in chapter 3 is the idea is that Tian has the 4 seasons, and it uses the 4 seasons to Cheng the year, right? The year is Chenged through, it's brought to completion, right? Or it's fully formed through the 4 seasons. You also see, as one of the things I was pointing out before, this distinction between sheng and cheng in Huainanzi, right? In 316, this comes up as well. And what they say are completed here, the things that are completed when they talk about completion, aren't here understood in terms of like shi or gong as in previous texts, right? So they're not affairs and they're not achievements, right? So we get a ton of discussion of that, right? How you can cheng a particular achievement, or you can properly complete a task that's given to you by the ruler or something like this, right? Or you can finish an achievement, right? But it's things, right? It's wu, right? That are completed in this sense, right? By the person, right? By the sage as well, right? So there's this passage here, there's a section here where they talk about wu being completed through 3 things, right? So it's through 3 aspects that things are completed. So there's an interesting passage, and this is what really kind of got me first thinking about this in terms of the Tianwen chapter. And it's in chapter 21. It's in the Yao Lue chapter on the overview of the entire Huainanzi, where it's trying to kind of piece these chapters together. And it talks about what the kind of payoff of the Tianwen is, right? Why we're engaging in this, right? This discussion of astronomy. And so it says the heavenly patterns chapter, the Tianwen chapter, provides the means by which to harmonize the qi of yin and yang, to structure, to li, the radiances of the sun and moon, to regulate the seasons of opening and closing, to tabulate the movements of the stars and planets, to know the permutations of their retrograde and proper motion, and to avoid the misfortunes associated with prohibitions and taboos, to follow the resonance of the seasonal cycles, and to standardize the regularities of the 5 spirits, the planets here. It enables you to possess the means to gaze upward to Tian and to uphold what to follow, and thereby avoid disordering the regularities of nature, right? Ren cheng, right? That if we don't do this, then we could actually cause disorder to the Cheng, right? To the Cheng of Tian, right? So there's this idea that in measuring, right, in doing all of this kind of activity, which they discuss in the Tianwen, right, that this is somehow patterning Tian in some particular way. It's in a way to create these Cheng of Tian. And so you get this opposition here of following, right? Following being doing things properly, and the disordering that can result if we don't follow these natural patterns. So humans, it seems like, can disorder the regularities of heaven itself, with the suggestion here being that failing to respond to the tianli somehow disorders them, right? It actually changes them in some important way. And so there's a discussion here of the general process in Huainanzi 3:21 as well, where they talk about the distinction between things, right? That creates yin and yang, and the yang comes from yin, etc., right? And that this process ultimately leads to the myriad things being cheng, right? The myriad things come to this completion, right? Through this process. And so the cheng that they're talking about here seems to be connected to this idea of the measurements, right? Measurements of the heavens, right? Or the kind of determination of particular points in the heavens in the way that we'll see in a minute here. Let's see if I can advance. Good. So one interesting kind of account that they give of a kind of potential human role, they give a mythical account, right, of the human role in the kind of construction of the cosmos or completion of the cosmos here, with the kind of the famous story about Gong and Zhuangzi in the ancient times, who were fighting each other to become emperor. And it says that enraged, they crashed against Mount Buzhou. The heavens' pillars broke, the cords of earth snapped, heaven tilted in the northwest, and the sun and moon, stars, and planets shifted in that direction. Right? So what they're doing here is they're giving an account of this, right? Why the ecliptic, right, is tilted, right? It's not exactly along the equator. Right? As we know, the Earth is tilted 23.5 degrees, and that's what happened, right? When Gong and Zhuangzi are fighting, right? They bashed into things, and it tilted the planet, right? Or it tilted the celestial sphere like this, so that it ends up this way. And so there's this explanation of things that we recognize in nature as being a result of these kind of former actions of these mythical human figures. So you have this initial disordering, and that gives us kind of an example of disordering, right? So you would have a more harmonious kind of lining of the ecliptic to the horizon, but because of this act of disorder, it throws these natural patterns out of order in this way. And so you get an initial disordering by the activity of non-tian agents, right? Neither of these characters are tian. That explains how things are as they are, as well as the need for completion, right? Why completion is necessary and why proper completion is necessary is that if we mess this up, we could get a radically different kind of cosmos that would be unfriendly to us, right? That would be something that would lead for it to be impossible for us to thrive, something like this. But tian, of course, is still doing work, right? Tian provides, it's still sheng's thing, right? It still generates. It provides the raw and unshaped material and patterns that can be completed into these kind of orderly regularities or can be disordered, right? So it makes the kind of role of humans critical here, right? To take what tian provides and kind of fashion it into something. One way I like to think about this is in terms of something like a set of Legos, right? So maybe tian gives us Legos and we're supposed to build this castle out of the Legos, but we could build something really crappy out of these too, right? We can build something that doesn't work, right? Something that falls apart. And so we have this responsibility to construct this thing out of these Legos in a way that's connected to some underlying natural patterns that works properly. So the account of the ruler's ability to cause disorder that you see in Tianwen and also other chapters of the Huainanzi follows the continuation of the story of previous chapters of the arising of things. So in the Yuan Dao and the Chuzhen chapters before Tianwen, you get this account of how all things come to arise. Of course, in the first chapter, Yuan Dao, right, how we have the origins of things from Dao. And then you get this discussion of the tilting of the ecliptic that I just mentioned. Then following this in Tianwen, you get a discussion of Ganying, right, of sympathetic resonance, we can call it, right, which I'll discuss in a minute. And this comes just before an outline of polar constellations, right? So why is this order happening, right? They're talking about the ecliptic, and then they go into Ganying, and then they're talking about like setting up constellations and organizing constellations. And it seems to be what's going on is that Ganying is the way that this completion works, or is at least one part of the story about how the completion works, along with shangtong, upward communication. So the completive operation of humanity, that is what we do in completing the cosmos, is understood as happening in these two ways, right? So you have shangtong, right, upward communicating to tian in this case, right? That's the shang, right? What's on high is tian. And then ganying, which is this sympathetic resonance, right? Which is explained in the text in terms of like the motions that happen like that connected to this. So they use this image of a string, right? When we pluck a string of a chin, something like this, right? That the string beside it also starts to respond and rotate from the or vibrate from the vibrations of the other string. Right? The same thing can happen with kind of human activity, and the idea being that the ways that we act have this kind of resonance on things in the world, in shaping tian, in shaping the natural world. So Ganying is discussed throughout the Huainanzi and in chapter 3 as well, where they say that things of the same category, right, move one another, right? So Ganying happens when there's something that's similar, right? One thing moves, something of its same category also moves, right? And then they say root and twig, ying, right? Root and twig resonate with one another, right? So there's this connection to the root and twig image here also kind of echoes this idea of ban and moi, right? That's used elsewhere in the text as this kind of overarching organizational category. In 321, later in the Tianwen, they discuss how humanity is modeled on Tian, and this is why, in some sense, the resonance works, right? Or why the upward communication works. So they say that Tian has 9 layers, right? And humans also have 9 orifices. Heaven has 4 seasons to regulate the 12 months. Man also has 4 limbs to control the 12 joints. Heaven has 12 months to regulate the 360 days, and man also has 12 joints to regulate the 360 nodes. Right? So now that they've given this, right, the idea is that resonance happens when you've got things that are similar enough together. Well, it turns out that tian and ren are actually similar kind of things, right? That one's modeled on the other, right? And so when things happen in the human world, it has resonance on tian, right? This is why we can upwardly communicate, right? Because tian isn't sufficiently different, right, to make that resonance not work, right? Given the way that they've understood resonance earlier in the chapter. So with this idea of upward communication, right, that is communication to tian, right, which we can understand in terms of resonance, right, or the kind of response of tian to the actions of humanity, one of the interesting things that we see in the Huainanzi, even though there's this kind of heavy focus on the ruler, is that they want to say that even the non-ruler can cause changes in tian, right? So the ruler as well as the non-ruler can do this, right? So there's a passage in chapter 6 where they talk about even a blind musician and a common woman, lowly and without status, possessing power so little as to be light like a feather, taking hold of their essences, of their jing here, and refining their thoughts, putting aside their daily tasks and collecting their spirit, they were able to communicate effects upwardly to tian, right? So this can happen if we're engaged in this kind of cultivational process such that we have access to tian, which is in part for the Huainanzi a matter of understanding tianli, right? And understanding tianli is a matter of understanding this root, which links all these various areas of human knowledge. So they give a couple of examples, right? They give a number of examples in the Tianwen chapter of completion, right? Of how we do this process, right? And what kinds of things in the world we can understand ourselves or humanity as creating. So the sun's motion is one, right? The sun's motion might not be the kind of thing that we would think of being like created in some sense or contributed to by humanity. But one of the things they seem to say in chapter 3 is that use of the gnomon, right? So they talk about how use of the gnomon is made to create the hours, et cetera. But they say it regularizes, it zheng, right? It makes regular the morning and the evening sun, right? So the idea is that there is no morning sun unless you've got the kind of demarcation to measure that as the morning sun versus the evening sun, whatever it is, right? We need to conceptualize this. We've got to create a morning and evening through the use of this gnomon, right? Through this kind of conceptualization. And then once we've done that, we have a morning and evening, right? In some important sense. And so there is some kind of pre-chung, right? Pre-conceptual, if you will, maybe fact of the matter about the way the world is working, but there are a number of things that we might be inclined to think of as given by the world, right? That actually are a matter of human construction or of human creation. In the case of the use of the gnomon, right? So it's to literally to make regular the morning and the evening. And so the gnomon here, right, it's a test for the solar motion. So one way we might think of a gnomon is, right, an instrument to track the way the sun is actually moving, right? There are these facts we might say about where the sun goes and all these kind of facts about the sun that are there, but that we can measure and access through the use of a gnomon. But the suggestion here seems to be that there's also more than this, right? There's a regularization of those motions, with the idea that if we use this improperly, right? If we do this ritual in that sense of using the gnomon improperly, then we can somehow mess up those motions, right? It's not just a matter of like our failure to be able to know those motions, but that we can operate on them. We can do something to them, right? We can conceptualize things incorrectly. And so it makes the solar motions accessible to the human world, right? That is the use of the gnomon in this case. But it patterns it just as ritual patterns human behavior, right? So it makes, it in a sense, creates those motions. It plays this creative, in addition to this kind of access role connected to these motions. Another great example, maybe the best one, right, in the chapter, is this example of determining the pole, right? Determining the position of the pole star. So this is a tricky one because this is a little bit different back in the time of the Huainanzi than what happened today. Today we've got a star in that location. We've got Polaris, right, the North Star. But at the time, right, back in the early Han Dynasty, there was no star, right, that marked the pole, right? There was just the asterisms with the constellations, other stars would go around this point. And this made a kind of difficulty for determining what that point was. We had to, in order to figure out the motions, we had to first get a fix on, okay, what's the pole point, right? And the pole point is something invisible. This seems to be the suggestion too, when there's this discussion in the Lunyu, right, of the kind of myriad things circling around the polar position, which does nothing in itself and literally is invisible in itself. It's almost like a wu, right? It's a nothing, right? It's just this kind of empty point, right? But it has this kind of power to move everything around it. And so tian itself, right, the idea is here, doesn't have these kind of unshifting regularities, right? And we have to determine the pole in some way, right? We have to use these instruments, right, to kind of find where the pole is. But that finding of where the pole is isn't just a kind of marking of something that's there. And that empty space, right, is a kind of visualization of this. Rather, it's a creating that point, right? So what we're doing in a sense is making that pole point. We're assisting tian, we're assisting what's given by the natural patterns to determine, to construct a cheng, a pole. Right? And so David Pankeneer talks about the connection of this to Zheng, right, to regularization, right, in terms of using and establishing the Ding constellation, right. And so there's this idea, this discussion in the Huainanzi, in chapter 3 of the Huainanzi, is that Tian first Chengs, right, and then Di later Dings, right, determines, right, and this being connected to this notion of the Ding constellation, right, the idea that once you have this, right, once you've created this pole, right, or at least partially created the pole, then all the other things can follow from that. And so before you've done this, you don't have any of the rest of it, right? That this is this crucial part of the constructive process that humanity is involved in. So while Tian seems to have determinate points that we can accurately or inaccurately access or measure, the human measurement process, according to the Huainanzi's view, also seems to play this kind of fundamental role in completing or instituting these patterns, right? Playing a role in making the patterns as they are, which goes back to this discussion about the wu, right? The wang wu as being somehow the pattern, the li of those things being cheng, right? That li can be cheng. This is a version of that. So, going back to this issue about the chang being luen, right? About the patterns or the regularities being disordered. The idea seems to be that failure to regularize, discern, and complete what's provided in heavenly motion is the cause, right? So you've got this bit that tian does, right? Tian has a kind of generative function, right? It's Sheng's thing, but what it's generating is a bit different than what we see in these earlier texts, where it might be it might be the idea is that, well, we get the whole kind of collection of things in the world. We get the celestial sphere as it is. We get tables. We get trees, we get everything, and that's given by Tian, and then we have this kind of like organizational process. Here, there seems to be this idea that the process of Cheng goes like deeper into the kind of Sheng, to what these earlier texts understood as Sheng, the process of making there be trees and the celestial sphere and all of these kinds of things also involves this kind of active work of human completion. And that this is why this kind of massive disorder in the cosmos can happen when we kind of fall down on our role of completing things in certain ways. So this issue is what happens, according to the Huainanzi, when we don't kind of Cheng things properly and disorder the regularities of nature. It issues, of course, in various kinds of disasters, right? So in 3.3 and 3.20, they talk about the variety of disasters that can result from these kind of improper organization or failure to organize the world in the right way. So these completed regularities of nature then involve human-constructed or determined features, right? Things activities or actions that we do. And so the disasters that result from this disordering that I just mentioned are discussed in the middle of the Tianwen chapter in the discussion of day and season oppositions, right, in 313. And so John Major in his 1993 work says that the effects here are strikingly similar to the effects predicted in Huainanzi 5 to occur if the ruler employs the ordinance of an inappropriate season at any time. They're also similar to the effects predicted in 5:14 through 25, where if government fails in its duties in any given month, disasters of various kinds will occur months later. So Tian operates as it does, in part then, right? Part of what's going on here, through the activity of the ruler, right? The ruler is the assistant of Tian in this sense, and then also kind of the rest of humanity, there's a suggestion, has some role in this as well. Whether these actions are appropriate or not, right? So the ruler can engage in inappropriate actions, which then complete these patterns of Tian in this kind of way that's going to lead to inevitable disorder. And so the response of Tian, right, part of what's going on here is an attempt to kind of naturalize the activity of Tian. The response of Tian is understood in terms of the continuity of these patterns, right? Of course, Tian responds like this because you constructed this thing now that operates in this way. Just like if I build a car that has a wheel that's permanently pointed left, then when I operate that car, it's going to go left, right? And it's not a matter of like the car like responding to me in a particular way. It's just you built it like that, and so it's going to follow this process, right? And so it makes it important. It shows how important it is for us to construct this, construct Tian in this sense, or construct nature, right, the world, the cosmos, in the right way. So what we see concerning the relationship in the Tianwen chapter between humanity and Tian suggests that this completing activity, the activity of Cheng here, which is what humans do in creating or completing these patterns, that's made through communication with Tian, and also made through this sympathetic resonance that becomes possible based on the similarity of humanity and nature, in part constitutes the activity of nature, right? So it is, so in a sense, our regularization, or our completion of the world can be understood in some sense as the activity of Tian, right? As this kind of like successive activity of Tian, which there's a kind of seed of this that goes all the way back to early texts like the Tai Sheng Shui, right, in which you get or the Lao Tzu, right, where you see this generative kind of conception, where you get this discussion of the sense in which Tai is always inherent in things, right? It's zhang, right? It's included in things, right? So you get this generative process from Tai down to I think they end with the Sishu, right? They end with the 4 seasons, with the implication that the myriad things emerge from this. But then in the myriad things, there's also the operation of Tai. It's still happening, right? Because of this connection. There seems to be a kind of drawing out of this idea here concerning the operation of Tian. And so failure to properly complete Tian's regularities, right, for whatever reason, leads to this disordering that's discussed in chapter 21. Right? So this gives us a kind of picture of how a specific text, right, how the Huainanzi could be seen as a kind of example of this movement or this development of a concept of Cheng, which is taking the human role back deeper into nature, right? Into what previously was kind of understood as the operation of Tian. Here, we start to get a view that humans play this kind of more robust role in the operation of Tian, which also then is meant to kind of make it more critical for us to perform the rituals, to act, to organize society in the right ways, so as to ensure really the integrity of the cosmos, which has parallels to what you see in Mesoamerican and West African traditions as well, which is part of the future direction of this project. Thank you. Sorry, yeah. Oh, go.
Because I'm teaching at 1 p.m.
Of course, of course.
So, I will try to make it as short as I can. So thank you for this amazing research. So does this semantic expansion of the term Cheng, where it used to be used in this ethical sense, and now it is used to talk about construction of the world, does this semantic development retrospectively tell us something about how it functions when it is used in the ethical sense. And as you were tracing the later usage of Cheng in especially Huainanzi and some other texts, this pair order disorder kept popping up, right? And would you feel comfortable making the leap and suggest that, well, maybe the ethical was always already about kind of bringing order to disorder? It could be affective, poetical, naturalistic, and if the ethical functions in that way, then that would maybe make this bizarre, like the evolution of the term, a bit more like intelligible, where if order and disorder is actually this intermediary, like connecting notion. Would you make that leap, or did this research in general change your understanding of how the ethical functions?
So I think that the ethical sense of Cheng is still operative here in the Huainanzi, and they certainly have this kind of view that you see throughout Han texts as well, that that understands order and disorder in terms of kind of ethical order, right? The order of society. In fact, that's kind of like what they're ultimately after with all of this, right? And they give this kind of other. So the interesting thing about Tianwen is that it seems to kind of move away from that, at least for part, right? So the idea is that, okay, we've got this kind of, we're concerned with order and disorder in the sense of like society, in the sense of, social and political kind of understandings. But then there's the kind of way in which the world can be like the cosmos, right, or the sky, right, or objects can be ordered and disordered that contributes to or kind of cuts against that project, right? So you've got this other sense of order and disorder that here in the discussion of the gnomon and the discussion of astronomy isn't directly linked to the ethical, but it is still understood in terms of order and disorder. Now they do end up going on to, so in chapter 21, for example, link why is disordering in this way problematic? Well, because it has these ethical implications, right? So the ultimate payoff is still ultimately ethical, right, for the Huainanzi as well. But one of the things that you see here differently, and one of the things you see in early Han material in general, is this kind of willingness or this kind of like this seeming need that they think that they have to get into metaphysics, right, in order to give an account of things like order and disorder and how this kind of has this ethical implications in a way that you don't see as much in the pre-Han text, right? This idea of, okay, we need to develop this kind of metaphysics in order to show how this kind of ethical how there are these ethical implications of actions, right? So Cheng, you talk about the kind of semantic development of Cheng here. I think in the Huainanzi, there's not so much a semantic shift in Cheng, right? So it still has the same kind of like meanings in the sense here. It's really, I would say, a kind of conceptual shift or addition to Cheng, right? So the idea is that, well, how do we understand something like completion or perfection or the full manifestation or development? Here, I think the idea is that, well, Tian fully manifests itself, or the Tian Li fully manifests themselves, not just through a process that's independent of, mind independent, right, independent of us, but in part through our operation. I think that's the kind of critical change, the idea of the way that they think of Cheng happening, right? So it still has, I think we can still kind of translate it in the same ways, right? It is really still has those kind of same meanings that I pointed out in the first bit, but what this process is like, I think here, and what that implies about what people are doing when they're chunging things, right? So for the early text, for example, when there's this notion of like tian shengzhi and ren chengzhi, right? The idea is that people just like, we take what's given and we organize it into societies and we have this kind of attitude toward it and we develop ourselves, et cetera. Whereas the ren chengzhi bit here is something like, no, we conceptualize things and we measure and we thus like regularize and create the world in some sense, right? But still has the kind of same kind of semantic scope, I think, in that sense.
If you could please use this microphone.
This is a really interesting talk, and I don't have a lot to say about the main point where you draw the development of the idea of Cheng within the Huainanzi. That seems really exciting, and how you're going to develop this in connection with Mayan philosophy and African philosophy seems also very exciting. I wonder if there's a couple opportunities where there might be some misunderstandings where you could maybe make advances built on the idea of Cheng on either side of what you're doing. So on one side, you're developing a chronology of Cheng where you started out with the Tai Sheng Shui, but you kind of set that aside and then you said, well, here's Xunzi, this is an ethical idea. And then we get a naturalistic view of it in the Huainanzi. But then as you developed the ideas and towards the end, you went back to the Tai Sheng Shui and to say, well, here's the naturalistic roots of it. And I wonder if this is an opportunity to call into question the research that you said many people have done about the development of these cosmological ideas. Because what the excavated texts show us is that Graham and Major's chronology of the development of cosmological ideas doesn't pan out because they were working before the excavated text came around. And I think those texts have, and you here have an opportunity, I think, to say, maybe this naturalistic idea was there all along. We've just lost those texts, and now we're getting some of them back. And this may be a way to talk more about that. That's one way. On the other end, you often use the word perfecting and completing as ways of translating Cheng, but sometimes you also say words like development and maturity and things like that. The analogies you used were the table, like IKEA table, where you have a where you have a plan, right, to begin with, and then when it's done, right? There's no more development. But the way that you described in the text was that there was a birth that was sort of biological, and then there was a maturity, but it wasn't done. There was still stages after that. And the Legos also, I wonder if the table and the Legos analogies don't fully do justice to the idea of Cheng as sort of that height of development as a stage of development. Because the reason I say that's important is because when you do these comparative things, when you say the idea of perfection, what people might jump to is that it's done. It's like we've got these Platonic forms and the plan of nature has been fulfilled. But there is no plan of nature, as far as I know. In your descriptions, there's no pre-existing plan of nature. You mentioned that things are always changing and that kind of thing. So just these.
No, that's a good point, and I think that is where the analogy kind of breaks down, right? Because it is, I think you're right, is to say that it's not a kind of process that we finish and then it's done and we don't have to do anything. In fact, that's part of it seems to be part of the point of what's going on in Tianwen, right? The idea of being that we have to continually do this over again, right? So that it's not that the ruler can just establish these kind of norms and then we're done, right? But this is a process that has to go on, right? And this kind of ritual process. And in the understanding of Cheng and in terms of like following a kind of guide or a map like the IKEA example, part of what I want to draw on there, and part of what I want to leave behind, I definitely want to leave behind the static aspect, right? Part of what I want to draw on there is the idea that you've got some kind of thing that this is you've got the plan, right, that this is responding to. You've got the kind of like the blueprint or something like that you're supposed to achieve. The difference between this case and then the IKEA case is that once you do that in the IKEA case, like you're finished, right? You don't have to do anything. Here, the idea is, I think, much more like what we see in the Maya tradition, for example, or the Aztec tradition, in which once you achieve this, and which is certainly consistent with early Confucian ideas too, once you achieve this, you've got to keep doing it, right? It's just like the person who becomes Ren, right? Ren is something that maybe you can hit on it, but then you can also fall, you don't just keep it, right? It's not this kind of stable state that you have forever. You've got to continually work, right, to stay there. So it would be like something like constructing the IKEA chair that you've got to constantly make sure stays in that way, right? That you can't just put it aside, right? So I think that's a good point, and that's a place where they kind of come apart. Oh yes, the naturalism question. Amen. That's a good point. That's a really good point. I think that it is there, right? And this is actually an argument that I've been having for years about people about Chinese metaphysics, for example, right? With the whole "there's no metaphysics in China" bit, right? And the idea that being that this somehow starts in the Han. Certainly the seeds are there from in the unearthed texts like Tai Sheng Shui. The kind of argument that I try to make here is that the naturalistic shift isn't so much a matter of like, now you've got this naturalism and that wasn't, or a kind of concern with metaphysics that wasn't in the tradition before, but that you've got a new way of kind of systematizing these things in terms of the systems of correlative cosmology that develop in texts like the Chunqiu Fanlu, et cetera. But certainly it's there in a host of other texts, right? Even the kind of traditional ones, right? We see these kind of ideas fall out. And so I think part of what I want to do in this kind of second part is to show that even though there's a development of new ways of thinking about the world and construction of the world, it doesn't kind of like get invented in the Han, right? They're building on these kind of earlier ideas that are there in the tradition, going all the way back into the the 4th century BC and before, right? As we see in these other texts. And I think, just like you said, a lot of our kind of like neglect of these texts, or the fact that we don't have these texts, is part of the reason that this idea that they're just not there, right?
The idea, is it on? Yeah. Okay. The idea that Cheng is something that, even though it's completed, You can't just leave it there. It's something that also carries over into, areas of Taoism, concerning beliefs about immortality, or the perfected, say in Shangqing Taoism. Even though they are completed or perfected, they still have to work at it.
Exactly.
Okay, they may be, say, elevated to the heavens or whatever, but they still have to undergo their own self-cultivation processes and maintain those.
Absolutely.
They cannot just, sit there and be divine, right?
No, that's a good point, and I think that's exactly what's going on here. Right? The idea being that there's a kind of what the Huainanzi is trying to kind of point us toward is the need to why it's so important to continually do these rituals in the right way, to continually organize society in these particular ways, right? Because you have, in a sense, right, and this is where I link it to the kind of Maya stuff, is that if you're not continually doing this, the world will literally like fall apart, right? And we see in the example of Gong and Zhuangzi, right, the idea being that there are certain things that we can do that can happen that can like radically alter the way the world is, and so this is why it's important for us to not just leave things aside, and including things like relying on what the sages did. Oh, the sages did it, it's fine, like they built the IKEA chair and I can just kind of like not worry about it, right? The idea is that, and this is, I suspect, right, that part of the reason that there's a focus on in addition to the ruler, the non-ruler operating, is for just that reason, right? Because if it's just the kind of sage ruler who operates, they can lead to a tendency to say, we don't have to worry about it, right? Yao and Shun did it, right? And so we don't have that responsibility anymore. And in order to kind of move us away from that, the Huainanzi seems to be focused on this aspect of like, it's all of us, we all play a role in this, right? The ruler organizes it, the ruler is kind of the manager in the process, right? But we all have to play a role in terms of the court astronomers and the medical feng shui and all these various kind of people to make sure this happens the right way continually, right? And this is exactly the same the idea that we see, this is kind of what got me started this whole thing, right? This is exactly the same idea we see in Maya conceptions of continual creation of the cosmos and these West African views that I talk about in the book, right? It's this notion of the necessary kind of contribution of these various kind of aspects of the community under the guise of the ruler to really kind of make sure that the cosmos continues, right? Continual creation is the name I gave this in the Maya case, and I think something like that works here as well, right? And this is something, as I mentioned before too, as you mentioned in the kind of case of Taoism, right, becoming a Shen, and then also in the Confucian case of like being ren, right? It's a matter of they're continually harping on this idea that it's not a static state, right? It's something that you can lose, right? That you can get there, and then you can say, oh, I became ren, right? Or I became this, and then like you move away from it, and now it's just as bad as if you'd never done it, right? Because now you're no longer concerned with it, and then the world falls apart, right? This is absolutely in the tradition.
I just find this idea of the co-constitutive role of tian and ren, and that chen is sort of like in the middle of it, as really intriguing. And I just want to throw two ideas at you. Basically examples at you. One is if you think about the world before watches had batteries, where if you wore the watch and you moved around, it would keep going. But once you put it aside, then it would stop.
Stops exactly.
Right. I mean, that in some ways that's the model I think that you're talking
That's a good
about,
one.
right? If the watch, we're not making the watch. We didn't make the watch, but once the watch is there, we're really essential in keeping it going, right? And then the other idea that I had, which maybe fits into the Mesoamerican piece that you're talking about, is that this is also a pretty good description of climate change, right? So that people are doing, if we don't do the right things, the world responds. It doesn't respond in the way that, we use coal-burning plants, and therefore there are 2 more earthquakes than there were last year, right? But there is this sort of way in which human action constituting the way the disorder in the universe is really captured by the idea of human-caused climate change.
This is a really good point, and I think this is one of the kind of payoffs that I'm hoping this has in the overarching project. Is kind of in the background is concern of how we think about our own kind of role in constructing the world, right? Both in the sense of like, just like you mentioned, climate change is a perfect example of that, right? The way in which our activities can kind of organize the world, as well as in the way of kind of like explaining why it is we fail to understand these kind of key features of the world, right? Which is there in the Zhuangzi and the Huainanzi, et cetera, right? So why don't we have like a unified theory, right, in physics, right? Or why is it the case that seemingly like in sort of quantum mechanics, right, that are kind of like observations of things seem to change the state or seem to have a bearing on the state of them, right? And I think the answer that comes out of some of these traditions that I'm looking at is that what we've neglected is the fact that we are taking ourselves out of the picture, right? That our observation of the world, our encounter with the world also includes us, right? And we have this tendency to see that as that stuff and then us as something separate. And if we collapse this and see tian and ren as the same kind of thing, this can have important implications for how we understand the world, and also, as you mentioned, implications for how we see our activity as like having this effect on the world, right? Which in cases like today, right, can have these catastrophic effects in things like climate change. Your watch example, I don't know why I hadn't thought it, because I'm a huge watch guy. So that's a perfect example, right, of that. It's the ritual, right? The ritual of moving of wearing the watch and making it be, right? And there's an additional feature here that's connected to the kind of gnomon example, which would be that the idea of like having the minutes and seconds and hours, et cetera, right? That don't exist without, because there's a question of like, oh, what time is it actually, right? Well, what time it is actually is what we've agreed on in terms of like measuring things based on the clock. We could do it differently, right? But we have it organized in a certain way based on our division of minutes and hours and seconds, et cetera, which we construct in the watch or in the clock, right? And so there are these various layers in which there's human activity that, in a sense, bring minutes, hours, bring time into existence. This is another kind of feature of the Maya stuff that I was talking about. This idea of the focus on time and the notion of like how we, in a sense, create it, right? So I'm gonna steal that example from you. That's a good one. I like it. Thank you.
I'm wondering if this particular idea is sort of very anthropocentric. Like, do they also apply it towards, because you have like this sort of mirroring image of the tian and the ren, where you have like the nine orifices versus like the tian has the nine cheng and what have you. I'm wondering if they also sort of tie it down to sort of the myriad of things, where you have like the animals, the sort of the trees and the mountains and what have you. Maybe the animals were more sentient beings. Like, do they also, their activities also reflect the heavens? Because I know like in other Taoist texts, such as the Zhuangzi, there's like sort of this emphasis on breaking down the anthropocentric views of the world and humans' role in it.
This is a good question. And so here, I think they do, right? There's this idea that the tianli, right, we could call it, or the way that Huainanzi understands the bun, the root of all things, right, is this kind of pattern that all things share, right? From tian all the way down to the wangwu, to the myriad things, right? Everything has this, right? But what seems to make humans able to communicate upward in a way that other things can't is this kind of like higher structural level of similarity that they have to tian than maybe like rocks or birds or something like this, right? They want to say that there is, right? There are these patterns and there are these similarities and those things are fashioned in the same way because of the pattern. But it might not be the case like that a rock or a bird can communicate upward to tian in the same way that humans can. And so humans then become, it's very kind of anthropocentric view in that sense, right? That humans become, in a sense, the kind of intermediary between tian and the wangwu, right? And that creates this kind of responsibility on the part of humans as well toward just like the rest of society as well as the rest of the kind of like constructed world, right? Because our activity can have this kind of massive effect on it, right? And so it's a way of trying to make sense of why it's critical for. So we might think, okay. I'm an academic who works on philosophy and religion, right? And in the U.S., like, what does my work have to do with like the construction of the cosmos or like organization of society or something like this? Or like you're a feng shui, right? You're a kind of court astronomer or a kind of a physician or something like this. And part of the idea is that the projects that we're engaged in, the Huainanzi wants to try to understand all of those as playing this kind of fundamental role in constructing the world the way it is, right? So when I do my activity in writing books and teaching and all the other kinds of things I do, right, it's playing this role in kind of constructing or in chunging things, right, in constructing a world such that it makes it possible for things to be orderly and organized and non-disordered, right? This is the idea. And so, but the only reason that can happen is because there's this shared pattern, that emerges in all things, right? Even in terms of birds and rocks and everything else, right? But that we have some kind of special access to it. And they understand this, I think it's chapter 7, the chapter Jingshan, right? They understand it through human Jingshan, right? Because we have Jingshan, we have quintessential spirit, I think is a way to translate it, or pure spirit, something like this, that rocks and birds and other things don't have, right? Which have this kind of like this greater resonant effect with tian. One way to understand it, using the image that they use in this kind of resonance of the string of the zither kind of example, that if you strike a string far away from another, it'll have a resonance on the far strings, but it'll have a greater resonance on ones closer to it, right? So it still has this resonant effect, right? Even on the most distant strings, but it's going to be like a relatively small resonance over here, and it's going to be this massive resonance on the things that are more nearby. And so, because in that sense, ren is closer to tian than other kind of things within Wangwu, we have this kind of like greater resonant effect on tian, this ability to communicate upward than any other things, even though they have them as well in some sense. Oh, is there multiple? Yeah. Oh, okay. I didn't know who was first. Sorry. Sorry.
So a quick question. Do you think that, or have you seen any passages from the Huainanzi where you can find like a epistemological version of this idea? I'm asking because it resonates a lot with later and very late developments of a similar idea, especially during Ming China. I was thinking throughout your presentation about Wang Yangming, like this idea that there's a codependency between perception and the way that things are in the world. So if I perceive the color of the flowers, that completes in a way the ontological or the essence or the identity of the flower. This is a long shot, but I'm just curious about that.
No, this is a good question. And I can't think of any where they talk specifically about perception. I suspect that in the case of Wang Yangming and other Dao Shui thinkers, that it has to do with Buddhism, right? And the focus on like, they would be upset, right, to say that they're Buddhist, right? But there's this focus on experience and perception that's there in Buddhism. Whereas here, it's there to some extent, and it's there even in early texts like the Zhuangzi, right? But it tends to be more of, rather than a kind of experience or perception of things, something like a conceptualization of things, right? The way that we think about them or the way we use them or the way we talk about them in terms of Ming, something like this. And I think that perceptual bit is there. It can be attached to that in terms of the way that we engage in shifei, right? So when we shifei, right, we kind of distinguish one thing from the other thing, right? And maybe there are certain ways that we experience this distinguishing the things when we distinguish one thing from the other. So I experience this as a table rather than as a wave or as a tree or something like this. But there doesn't seem to be, in the same way there is in Wang Yangming, a kind of pointing to this idea of perception, right? Or pointing to these kind of like this experiential aspect of constructing things. Although this can certainly be used for that in that way, right? I think in the Huainanzi, in the Zhuangzi as well, right? It's even though they don't seem to directly point to it, as far as I can think. So in the Zhuangzi, right, they talk about the Chengxin. The xin here isn't really seen in terms of like perception or in terms of experience, but in terms of like the way that we distinguish things, our Ming, the ways that we apply names, something like this. But I think it's, especially when we start to get like very kind of perception, experience heavy traditions like Buddhism in the picture, it naturally kind of lends itself to that. Like we can think of that in the same way, which I suspect is what's going on with some of the Neo-Confucian thinkers. That's a good question.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm just interested more generally in finding out, are there any aspect of metaphysical or ethical aspect of the idea of Chen being integrated or into the specific ritual at the time, early Han or later periods? For example, the idea of failure to perform certain like complete you mentioned about the Tian's regularity might result in disorder or disaster. Do we see any evidence of that, like stating that if the ruler should perhaps follow certain kinds of like standards, otherwise disaster follow? I'm just interested in learning about that.
Yes, so the discussions of Cheng here seem very generalized, right? So the idea is that they describe this process of kind of how to establish the processes of various practices that are being done in the Han at the time, right? Establishing the hours and the basis of the gnomon, right? The various ways that we establish the pole, right? All the kind of practices of the feng shui and the astronomers, et cetera. And then they kind of they link this in this general sense to Cheng, being that what they're doing is is this kind of form of Cheng. And the rituals are important because they have this kind of implication on the pattern or the regularities of nature in that sense. But they don't directly use Cheng in terms of the ritual, right? So the ritual seems to be understood in terms of what the ruler does, for example, and what the ruler uses, and what all these kind of these specialists and experts are doing is understood in this kind of general way in terms of a Cheng, right? They're engaging in Cheng, right? Whether the Cheng specifically applies to this particular ritual or whether it's a general process, the idea being that their creation through these rituals is a form of Cheng, something like this, it doesn't really specify, right? It doesn't give us a kind of technical definition of Cheng in terms of like its connection to particular rituals. But it does suggest, or it does actually outright say, that performance of the right kinds of rituals in the case of the ruler and activity of the right kind in the case of like the specialist, right? Dividing up the year in the right way, for example, is a version of Cheng, right? And that if we do, and it doesn't even tell us too which ones are the incorrect what are the incorrect ways of doing this. It just gives us this kind of list of processes, right? So it talks about all these things that the astronomers do and says, well, it's important to do these because you have this kind of you have this process of deregulation that can happen or disordering that can happen if you do these wrong. And we can imagine the ruler becoming kind of paranoid because you're like, okay, well, how do I avoid that, right? Is there a specific ritual that I engage in, or is there a specific process? And it's kind of silent on this, right? I think part of the reason for that is the Bunhua structure, right? The idea that the Huainanzi seems to be after is that what's critical for us to know in order to know how to perform the rituals right, in order to know how to kind of like develop ourselves correctly, is knowledge of the Bun. But like in the Zhuangzi, knowledge of the Bun is not something that's codified, right? It's something that's much more general, that we can only intuit from a kind of our understanding of numerous different aspects of human knowledge, right? So we can't just say, here it is, here's the list of what the Bun is, what the Tian Li are, right? We only gain it through knowledge of a variety of different areas. One example I sometimes use is language, right? So when we're learning different languages, the idea is, well, if we can have some general conception of what it is to say that I'm hungry, for example, right? But the sentence will be different in various different languages, right? And it won't be identical in any of those. But we start to get a better conception of like ways that humans might linguistically think about hunger when we understand 5 or 6 different languages, right? We're not going to get a kind of a language of thought, right, that's independent, where we can say this is definitively the proper sentence to use, but we can start to see patterns emerge, right, in a way that we can access through any given language. So it seems like that's what's going on concerning ritual here, which is part of the explanation for why it's giving this very general account. Do you have time for one more? Because she was waiting for.
Oh, my question is just about the concept shangtong. I'm just curious, like, how does Huainanzi sees the communication happening with the nature, or like how the other texts perceive it?
I think that what's going on is that the way shangtong works is through ganying. I think so. The idea is that the upward communication is that, well, we do things that heaven somehow responds, right? So the information, however we understand this, is communicated upward to Tian, and that understanding happens through, and the reason we can have this communication with Tian is because of ganying. So I think there's a kind of, in a sense, maybe a reduction of one to the other, right? So the idea is that when we think about how ganying works, they usually put it in terms of things that are similar resonate, things that are similar moving because other things that create them. But then they want to understand how there's a kind of, how this specifically happens with reference to Tian. And so I think part of what they're doing is that shangtong, in the case of humans to Tian shangtong, is a matter of, it's a particular kind of application of ganying. Ganying, of course, is much more general, right? So there might be a ganying between humans and like the natural, or humans and another animal, or humans and another human, or something like this. But I think it's a special case of ganying that operates in that sense.
I'm in thanking Dr. McLeod for his fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.